everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. Thank you to FRAM's members and RAM staff for taking time out of your busy days to be with us. My name is Jessica Telford, and I'm the marketing coordinator for Friends of Royal Alberta Museum Society, or FRAMS for short. We would like to recognize that we are webcasting from and to many parts of Alberta today. Alberta is located on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territory and is a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples. FRAMS respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional and ancestral gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuits, and many others. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived on and cared for these lands. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude. Acknowledging traditional territory is just one part of recognizing and moving beyond colonization and strengthening our relationships. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. We at FRAMS are very proud to sponsor and administer the Indigenous Student Museum Internship program. For nearly 25 years now, the program has provided an important paid opportunity for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit post-secondary students to gain valuable career skills in a museum setting. Over the years, nearly 60 students have participated in this unique program. Many have continued on in the museum field or have gone on to complete additional degrees. Skye Haggerty recently completed her second year in the ISME program. Due to COVID, the timeframe of the program was a lot different this year than in years previous. Typically, the program runs for 16 weeks in the summer. This year, due to COVID, the students completed the program over a longer stretch. Skye and the museum staff did a great job adapting to these times. We're pleased to share that the next 2 interns for the 2021 cycle have been selected and will be starting later this spring. We're so happy to have Skye with us here today to share her experience and knowledge with us. I'd like to mention, for those of you who weren't able to join us live for ISME intern Maria Nelson's talk on April 29th, or if you would like to give it another watch, the recording is now available online. We'll post a link to it in the chat window in a few moments. Before we kick things off today, I have a few housekeeping items to mention. Along the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button and a Q&A button. Please also feel free to use the chat window to make comments or have discussions. You can also reach out to us in the chat window if you have any tech issues. As for any questions you have for Skye concerning her presentation today, please enter those into the Q&A window. Following Skye's presentation, we will hold a Q&A session. You can enter your questions at any point during today's talk. Closed captioning is available. There's an option to activate it along the bottom menu bar. And just to let you know, we're recording today's session, and in the next few days, a link to view the recording will be available on the FRAMS website. And that's it for housekeeping items. A big thank you to Emma Knight, who will be introducing Skye and moderating today's discussion. Emma is Assistant Curator of Indigenous Studies at the RAM, as well as Skye's ISME Supervisor. I'm going to pass things over now to Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. And thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Emma Knight and I'm the Assistant Curator of Indigenous Studies here at RAM. I'm a settler and first generation immigrant, and I was born in a small town in southwestern England called Weajiford on the banks of the River Torridge. It's my privilege to live, work, and play here in Amiskwaciwa, which is Treaty 6 territory and the traditional territory of the Nayawa, Nakota Sioux, and a homeland to the Métis. Edmonton has long been a gathering place for generations of Niitsitapi, Stoney, Tsuut'ina, Saulteaux, Dene, Inuit, and many other Indigenous peoples. I'd like to take this time to give thanks to all of the elders and knowledge keepers that I have the honor of working with here at the museum, as much of our work would be impossible without them. And I commit to making space for Indigenous voices, knowledge, and presence within the museum so that Indigenous histories and relationships of this land can be shared by those who know them best, and to move towards a decolonizing of this space. So thank you to everyone for making time to come to this presentation. Thank you to the FRAMS board, president, and members for continuing to fund ISME. We're very fortunate to both provide museum training to these fantastic students, but we also learn so much from them in return. So I'm just going to introduce Skye now. Skye Haggerty is a Two-Spirit Métis student from Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement. He's currently working on a History of Art, Design, and Visual Culture honors degree at the University of Alberta with a focus on Indigenous material culture and visual representations of nature. We're very lucky to have had the pleasure of working with Skye in Indigenous Studies for 2 ISME terms. In her first summer with us, Skye played a major role in helping us to prepare for the Indigenous Studies collections move from our old site to the new museum. Along with our other ISME intern, Rogan Alexis, who worked in archaeology, she created custom padded storage trays for 6 cabinets of birch bark and willow baskets, which is no mean feat. That's a huge job. Skye also developed programming around birch bark baskets for Indigenous Peoples Day and documented her process in a beautiful blog post, which I'll put the link for in the chat. And Skye was also instrumental in helping facilitate community visits to the Indigenous Studies collections and finished her term by creating a concept proposal for an exhibit about Indigenous fire stewardship. So even though the museum has been closed this year and we've not had members of the public visiting, Skye has been hard at work on some fascinating research projects, which she will discuss in her presentation. And I'm really excited to hear from her today. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Skye and we can get started. Thanks.
Thank you, Emma, for that wonderful introduction. It truly has been a pleasure. So I'm just going to start my presentation. Also, thank you everyone for taking time to attend my talk today, and I really look forward to sharing this with you. Sorry. Oh my goodness. There we go. Okay. So the title of my presentation is Making Community, the Invisible Stitch in Métis Material Culture. I want to begin with a little bit of, I guess, adding on to the introduction provided by Emma and by FRAMS. So I am, in a sense, a visitor to Edmonton or Miskwasi-Wakasigan. I am originally from Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement. I essentially spent the first 20-some years of my life there before moving to Edmonton for education. And in some ways, even though I've made a home here in the city, I still consider the bush to really be my home. I am actually a 6th-generation descendant of Chief Black Powder. And in addition to that, my family's roots kind of spread all over this province, as you will see in the presentation when I get to some family photos. Also important and kind of integral to the approach to my projects is that I am from a family of makers. My grandmother, who raised me, has always been involved with some sort of creating, whether it's sewing or sometimes reaching out to like doing pottery, and also being active in the community as a teacher of these different kind of crafts and techniques and sharing her knowledge. And that is something growing up that is a part of my roots that I was also involved in and has become increasingly more important to me as I get older. And also through the experiences and the opportunities that I have had at the Royal Alberta Museum to work with items in the collections. So go to next one. I also want to say that unless there is a source or a link provided, the photos collected here are mostly taken by me, but I did make sure to provide some details and properly cite them otherwise. So for the first part of my internship, when I started in November of last year, one of the projects I took on was writing kind of a blog post about the Métis pudding, La Potian. And it was interesting to me because it came up in a discussion with my family, and they mentioned traditional Métis foods, and we were talking, kind of going through the different typical meals, and then coming to dessert, my mom mentioned la potiane, and I asked what it was because I had no idea. And she informed me that, oh, it was a kind of like boiled or like steamed pudding. And of course, with the comments like, oh, I used to make it all the time. She did have a recipe, but we couldn't locate it at that visit. And coming away from that, I was just kind of consumed or fascinated by this dish that was so Métis, but yet I had like no idea. And older people did seem to kind of know about it. So I kind of went on a search, and I managed to locate a recipe that was provided by a gentleman who passed within the past couple of years, Lawrence J. Barkwell, who did a lot of work for, I guess, what is now considered the Gabriel Dumont Institute, just in amassing information and stories and posting them online for free access, which is amazing. So I located this recipe, and as a part of my research process, I wanted to actually make it. And then I realized that despite having the recipe, I didn't really have any sort of direction with it. So I ended up doing some additional research into kind of boiled and steamed puddings. And it's interesting because there's a lot of similarities to other dishes, such as I think it's Newfoundland's like figgy duff, made in a very similar way. And I kind of started thinking about like the possible origins, although I couldn't exactly find a source. It is definitely a dish that has been adopted by the Métis people, obviously, and made into its own iteration. So, and this is a photo here of the finished product, fresh out of the pot. It does change slightly in appearance. And the texture on the outside is partially to do with a technique I used. So once I had my recipe, and once I had a kind of a general idea of how to approach this, I set about kind of like getting my ingredients together. And that involved making some decisions and thinking about the kind of ingredients that were available. I ended up using raisins and currants, and those would have been historically available to people. I also found out that even though that is kind of one of the typical options for this recipe, it really can be anything. My mom, for example, shared with me that she liked to use cut up dried apples, and sometimes kind of like the candied cherries that one would normally use in, say, like a fruitcake recipe. I also chose to use lard, although the original recipe recommended beef suit. And that was just a matter of availability. Another thing too is like this pudding would have been made, it wasn't really made just at any time of the year or for any particular reason, although you could do that. It was often made in the winter around Christmas, and usually there was two puddings made. One would be shared on like at a Christmas dinner, and then one was actually saved for New Year's Day. So once I had my ingredients and kind of like an idea of the process, I just had set out to make it, and then I immediately hit a roadblock. Um, I didn't know how long to cook it. I knew that I had to mix up the dough and kind of put it in. I ended up using like a cotton muslin, and gather it, and then put it in simmering water, or maybe it was boiling water. I wasn't sure on that either. And so I actually took to social media and I shared that I was making this traditional boiled pudding. And within minutes, actually, an aunt reached out to me from the other side of my family, and she kind of confirmed like, oh, how was I making it? Was I baking it or boiling it? Which was an interesting question. And it took me off guard, but I kind of just shared with her what I was doing. And I said, yeah, I don't know actually how long to cook this. And she gave me the right time, which is she cooked 3 hours, which is extraordinarily long to me, someone who's just used to oven baking. And what kind of stood out about that is that I never expected that. And it was so nice to have a family member, reach out and like help me with this. And on top of that, I also ended up speaking to one of my great uncles, and I was telling him about working on this blog and how I was like making la poutiane, and he shared this memory with me that I do include in my write-up about standing at the kitchen table helping my great grandmother mix the ingredients. And that was just, I could tell that it brought some joy to him to be able to kind of reminisce about that with me. So and this is just some more kind of like process photos that went along with it. It also, the recipe comes with an additional kind of like sauce that is meant to accompany it. But personally, I preferred it after a day or so and just lightly buttered. And I also have to say it is very similar to bannock. It's just a much kind of like tenderer, softer bannock if you have ever had it. And if not, I definitely recommend it. And it's a relatively easy recipe, so I could see how it would kind of become a staple in a sense of something that you could just kind of like make out of what you had at the time, especially during the winter and during lean months. Even though sometimes you may have had like a little bit extra money, you always like, you knew you could like make this and you could provide for your family or for like visitors. So it was a really enjoyable kind of project to start off my internship with. The other major kind of project that I undertook was writing or rewriting a text for the Red River cart exhibit, and essentially undergoing the process of coming up with this text and then submitting it for what I hope will be a new panel. And for this, it was a little less hands-on in some sense. I didn't end up doing a lot of research about the carts, and I also ended up interviewing one of the makers, which Vern Cook. He was working at the Remington Carriage Museum at the time. He's also of Métis ancestry. And we kind of just ended up like talking about the actual like structures themselves, and the fact that these were made entirely from wood, and with essentially a shakanathi like binding, which would be like hide like on the wheels, and how they were so practical and yet durable, and how they were very much made for the terrain, made for moving across the prairies. And um, ended up being pointed in the direction of actually a Marilyn Dumont poem, which I would have liked to have shared. However, I realized much too late that I should have obtained permission, but I can tell you about the idea behind it, in a sense, is that because these structures were made from wood, they were incredibly noisy. And I think that's something that isn't necessarily in the gallery. Doesn't you see, excuse me, these carts, but you don't hear them. You don't see them moving. And apparently the racket was awful. And you add to the fact that quite often these traveled into hundreds together, because they were transporting the goods, like they were actively a part of a trade. And you can just you have to imagine like the squealing of like these axles, that like you can't, because you can't use grease, it'll pick up dirt and it'll break down everything faster. And Dumont kind of touches upon that, like the noise that kind of shattered the stillness of the prairie. And at the same time, she also addresses how these carts serve the people, what they did for the people, how they were, yes, they were used for trade, but they were also defenses. They could be drawn together, kind of like, as it said, in a circle to kind of like protect one another. And they were homes. You don't quite often see them depicted, but there would have been sometimes like a little covering, and it's kind of like a wagon in some senses. And these are like items that are like structures that moved families. They moved people across like unimaginable distances. Like, to me, like even with a car in contemporary times, to go from Minnesota to Manitoba to all the way out to Edmonton, that is an incredible trip. And yes, they did break down, but part of that was like they were so easy to repair. As long as you were following the rivers, you had access to trees usually, and it was easy to either make the repairs you needed or to take the spare wooden parts all along with you. I read one source that said it was very kind of commonplace for one of the traders to take, say, like 3 or 4 like extra pieces. And when I think about that, I'm on one hand considering how that person had the foresight to kind of like watch out maybe for themselves, like the knowledge that like, yes, this cart might break down and I am going to need to fix it. But when you combine that with the fact that they traveled in groups and numbers, they weren't just watching out for themselves. They were watching out for everyone who was traveling with them. Because if someone else's cart broke down and maybe they didn't have the foresight, maybe this was their first trip and they didn't know, then they could help them. They could and that's why I selected this photo, even though it comes from Minnesota Historical Society, is I like seeing these groups together, because of thinking how maybe if they just work together, but also they had their own sense of community that they made. So, so it was very enlightening and wonderful to have the opportunity to work on a text for the exhibit, which led to kind of other connections for me as well. The other intern that was Maria Nelson that I worked with, not as much as I would have liked, but it was, she actually, we were kind of doing this brainstorming one day in the office about like these cards and talking about the noise. And she brought to my attention, she shared with me that her friend, Brianne Lizotte, who provided the music actually for the beginning of her presentation and also mine today, she has figured out how to kind of recreate that creaking wooden noise. And we kind of like that, which was so cool. It's so interesting. And we came with this idea that maybe, you know, hopefully at some point we can actually have that sound in the gallery. But as I said, I only kind of like knew Maria through work. But if I hadn't met her, if I hadn't known her, if I hadn't had that kind of like that very small community connection, I would have never have known about Brianne Lizotte's work. So the collaborative process was very essential to writing the text. And that's not even to mention the very helpful and appreciated editing that the text underwent with Emma and others in the department. I do want to quickly add that it also made me rethink while I was looking for photos in the archives of these cards, how they're portrayed, and specifically reconsidering kind of like the roles women played. I think in we all kind of like really liked the image on the right of the lady with her cart, you know, and you can kind of like presumably see her dwelling in the background, and that's her vehicle, that's her car. And she has, I want to say, like, there's something about this that at least suggests to me that like she has the skills and the expertise to fix this cart herself. And you know, that kind of like the independence that comes with vehicles, and also kind of this like the diversity of experiences that women had. Women were actively moving around, living by themselves. I know at least two individuals who they're Cree and Métis, who in their 60s essentially packed up everything after, you know, like their husband sadly passed away, and went out and lived by themselves. And like just the strength and the knowledge that to be able to do that is amazing. The ladies on the left, or the right, I should say. Oh, Mike, I'll have to correct that. I was talking about the image on the left. The ladies on the right, that card comes from the Red Deer and District Archives. And the lady wearing the hat, essentially came out to Alberta on that same card. And then I think it's 30 some years later, she you know, had it fixed up, and she rode it or like drove it during a parade actually. So I love these pictures. So kind of move on to, I guess, what was I picture is probably the bulk of my presentation today. But kind of like drawing in from this idea of like the knowledge and the work of women, especially Métis women. For the last section of my internship, I was focused on essentially taking a pattern from a Mackinaw jacket that is in the Royal Alberta collections. So I'm going to start with kind of explaining or trying to explain what a Mackinaw jacket or a Mackinaw coat is. It's typically described as kind of like a woolen, kind of shorter plaid coat. And that is about where you can stop for trying to describe it, because there are actually many different iterations. And later on, I will kind of take you through some of the different kind of transformations that this coat has gone through over a period of 200 years, actually. So I first heard about the Mackinaw jacket from my family. And it came with the comment that, oh, well, you know, the Métis made the Mackinaw jacket. And first of all, I didn't quite know what to make of that comment, because I'd never heard it before. I knew about other types of blanket coats, such as like the capote or like the Red River coats. And I, once again, came away with like just this kind of like burning curiosity, and I set out to find out if there was truth to that, and what exactly, and if so, what exactly did it mean? What is the history of this garment? But when I set out to try and find history, it was unexpectedly vague, difficult. There was this idea of the Mackinaw jacket is very kind of nebulous in a sense. And I struggled to find examples that predated the 1900s. But I did actually find that the coat has Indigenous origins. And it was, in my next slide, I will discuss that a bit more. And once I kind of had that confirmed in a sense, I wanted to I decided like I wanted to do a project with one. I wanted to do something that, you know, I want to like learn as much as I could about these coats, and I wanted to find one, and I wanted to somehow recreate it. So that is kind of, that became like the scope of my project, is that I wanted to develop kind of a module actually to share that kind of takes it from essentially like the history through like a making process in recreating this this coat, and then finally with like kind of like a reflection on both that process and the comparison of the two and what is kind of learned. And as well, because I learned about this jacket from my family, I wanted to find out if there was a family connection. I want to find out if there was any photos of the Mackinaw jacket that apparently my great grandfather used to always ask about. Before he would go to town, he would say, "Oh, where's my Mackinaw?" So starting with the origins, over the course of this kind of project, I located two sources. Initially, the source that seems most often quoted is The Sword of Old St. Joe, which is a self-published book by H.J.L. Woolley, who I managed to find out there's not a lot of information about him, but he was a reverend in kind of lower Ontario area. I should say Southern Ontario. And he talks mostly about the fort, but he does have a chapter kind of devoted to the story of how the Mackinaw coat came about. And the second source I found later on, which is from about, I should say, actually, the first one was published in like the early 1900s. Let's say 19 in the realm of like the 1920s. And the second source was published in 1966. And it also makes reference to the code while providing some very surprising information about the individuals involved in this in the history of this garment. And it does not actually refer back to the Sword of Old St. Joe, so it's an independent source. And I just wanted to kind of talk about these because in my research, I was curious about where they were getting their information from. And I found that the first one is sourced from military letters from the Canadian Archives. So communications between the fort and the, I guess the, well, within the British military. And the second source takes its information from archives in Detroit. And it's kind of, it's neat because the supposed, like they quoted origins of this jacket is kind of between these two areas are very like close. They're both in the Great Lakes area. So, and I always find it interesting to kind of find sources from like different locations that are, you know, kind of saying the same thing, so you can have a better idea or a better standing with that information. So the story goes that the Mackinaw jacket was originally from Fort St. Joseph, which is on St. Joseph Island in Ontario. And it's kind of located between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan in the Mackinac area, like the Mackinac Straits, which is where the coat takes its name from. Sorry, I keep switching back and forth between coat and jacket, but the Mackinaw jacket takes its name from that area. And it was commissioned by a Captain Roberts to the keeper of the King's General Store at the fort, which was a John Askin Jr. And he commissioned these coats because whether it was due to miscommunication with headquarters or just a delay, he did not have coats for his men for the winter. And John Askin Jr. Took on this commission, which was like a bit of a risk because he was just going ahead and doing this without asking permission for the supplies. And he took approximately 40 coats and he had them made into coats by his wife, Madeline Askin, and also the women of the fort. And Woolley quotes this as being somewhere between 8 and 10 women. And the fascinating part kind of comes in, or the surprising part comes in, is that John Askin Jr. and Madeline Askin were Indigenous. And by modern standard, or like we would contemporarily consider them Métis. John Askin Jr. was the son of a fur trader, and his mother is unnamed, but she was of the Ottawa. And we don't know the family of his wife, but she is noted as being Métis. And additionally, the women of the fort are also described as either mostly Métis or European, which is slightly questionable. And what I would venture is that considering the time period and the time period and like the kind of the way Métis have essentially been hiding in plain sight for a long time. Quite often, if sometimes identifying with their European parents, is that these women may have been of Indigenous descent. So after that initial commissioning of the codes, the Mackinaw jacket kind of disappears in one sense. I still have not been able to locate an example of an older code, but it does kind of come back as a part of what I would say like the wear of like lumberjacks. It becomes associated with the logging industry, and especially kind of like the bright plaid pattern, which actually was not the original intended color. The blankets selected for the first coats were blue, preferably, and then they moved on to red, and then finally they kind of left with plaid. So I find it kind of funny that the plaid became the most popular choice for the coat. So it was associated with the logging industry through like the mid to late 19th century. And then in World War II, actually, the American Army developed their own Mackinaw jacket, or what it became known as a Jeep coat, because it was given to drivers or like individuals who saw low combat. And it kind of looks similar to an earlier description of the code, with like the sort of like the storm collar and like the double row buttons. But it did undergo dramatic change. They changed the design twice, and by 1943, they ended up with a garment that had a notched collar and had completely done away with the double breast, like the double row of buttons. The British ETO as well also issued one in 1943 and kind of followed a similar suit in terms of changing the design. After the war, it became, I think, associated with kind of sportswear. Became like a sports jacket, or something for like kind of like being outside, but in a leisurely way. And this also has to do with, I should say, during the early 1900s, some companies such as Wilson had already kind of patented their own Mackinaw jacket. And these jackets, which you can kind of see like in the ad, and then there's also examples like a much more contemporary one, they do not resemble the other two codes here. And where these jackets get their name from is actually not from the design, but from the use of Mackinaw cloth, which was a wool kind of, it's a woolen cloth with that, usually like a buffalo kind of checker, like plaid weave. And so that's where they take the name Mackinaw from. So now, in proceeding with this project, I want to pick a coat, and I was very happy to find that we had two examples in our collections. One you can see actually on the previous slide here. This is a GWG Mackinaw jacket. And it has that kind of like notched collar, but it still has like the double button design, and it's also missing the belt. The other one we have, which is from the first Mackinaw slide, is much longer. It has the belt, has like a different kind of like weave. It's a much heavier, hardier coat. The original owner of that coat was a gentleman named Alex Waddy, who he was from Ontario. He moved his family to Alberta in 1906 to the Amisk area. And he was, from the information we have in the accession files, he was a logger in his younger days. He was also a farmer, and he had a trap line. He also hunted as well. And these were really big factors in picking this coat, because I realized I was looking for a coat that not only looked similar to what maybe an earlier kind of design, like when the original coats may have looked like, but also something that kind of like meshed or like fit with the lifestyle that is kind of like associated with the coat, which is very often working class, even though the coat has military origins. So when I saw this coat, initially my impression was that I think I want to work with this one. And then we also, learning all this information, I was like, yes, this is the one. And this is a picture that we have in the file of him actually wearing it. And I believe those are coyotes. I don't think there's a date associated with this, but the kind of the lifespan of this coat is somewhere between roughly around like 40 years, from like 1906 to 1946. So the process, I worked with a member of the conservation team, Brenna Cook, who took me through this, like, was such a indispensable like help and like a guide. Like her expertise made this happen. And in kind of this wanting to like recreate this coat, I had to take a pattern. Like I could not simply go out and buy a pattern of this coat and then make that. So that involved like kind of learning about this process, which learning about this process and also getting to know the coat, and to kind of like the method that we settled on, which is essentially like pinning the cotton muslin to the garment very carefully, for both more so for my fingertips' sake rather than the coat's sake, but it still very carefully. And then kind of taking a pencil and like tracing the seam lines, and that is working hands-on with this garment and kind of being in there, and you really learn a lot about it. You start to see beyond the surface. You start to kind of see the life of the garment, like where there's wear on it, where there's mending has been done, and kind of like how like one sleeve is slightly bigger than the other due to just like wear. And so that was like, it took quite a bit of time to take the pattern. But it was like, I'm so glad that I decided to go with this rather than trying to just find a pattern and kind of make that. I wouldn't have had the same insight given to me by that. And then once I had all the pieces, I had to sew the mock-up, which was going to be the recreated garment. It's like the trials and tribulations of a beginner sewer. I went into this fairly confident that because I had helped my mom sew things and cut things out, like growing up and like into like my adult life, that this would be easy peasy. And it wasn't, I would say it wasn't difficult, but it was its own learning process. And like while especially I was cutting out the pattern pieces from the cotton, the yards and yards of cotton muslin I used, I was always just looking at it and thinking like, oh, all these scraps, and like, oh, I could have used this space better. And that is definitely my upbringing talking, trying to kind of be economical and like use the material, like get as much as you can out of it, do not be wasteful. And I don't think it's necessarily in retrospect being concerned with what the material kind of like in saving money. In a sense, it's being respectful to the material in a sense, like not and not wasting it. The picture here actually is an alternative method that I started for the pattern taking. I'm just trying it out with Brenna, where you because I was curious, like, well, say you have a garment that you can't really just move about and like stick pins into, and then this is a way of being less intrusive. You essentially make this grid out of thread and like pins along the seams, and then you transfer that onto gridded paper. And this was actually kind of fun to do, but I could quickly see how it would require just as much patience as the other method I chose. And then after I had kind of sewn the mock-up and put it together, we did a comparison and kind of did some reflection on like the making process. And this is where I really started to see the string kind of that came loose in a sense, or at least enough for me to kind of notice it. When, as I said, like the help that I received in doing these projects, it was indispensable. But it also really made me think about, in this case, the women of the fort working on this code. And, I just said I had help and input, especially in struggling with the sleeves. Sleeves there's a reason they're called evil sleeves. But I was kind of, in a sense, making this in isolation. And those first coats wouldn't have been made that way. They would have been, I cannot imagine each woman going off by herself, and making a coat out of this blanket. They would have probably sat together, they would have sewn together and visited and talked. And more importantly, they would have helped each other. It's like my mom would definitely have things to say about my sewing on this, but it wouldn't be criticism for the sake of criticism, because more importantly, she would help me figure out how to fix it and how to kind of put it right. And it was while I was looking at this mock-up, and comparing to that, I really started thinking about other things too. Like I have mannequins to put to kind of put this garment on. They didn't have mannequins, so what did they do? Did they get men from the fort to kind of like try on these like half sewn coats while they were pinning them? Or more likely, did they try them on themselves? I know a couple of times I would take the mock-up and put it on myself and kind of just like look at it, and that just comes so natural, that it was something that I realized that kind of like that I felt connected to, perhaps this imagined past, but kind of based in practice. And and based in kind of like just actually making this garment. So that was something, this kind of like the string that kind of like teased out. And another thing too is I mentioned the mending of garments. Is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is that why do we mend garments? Is it strictly for economical reasons? Is because like we have to make things work? I think that's a big factor. But I also, in the case of this coat and looking at the sections where there's orange thread that is kind of like fix the pocket and like fix the patch on the back, and someone, maybe his wife, sat down and took his coat and put it on her lap, and took the time to fix this, not necessarily because she had to make it last, but because she didn't want her husband to have a raggedy coat. And that care becomes literally embodied in the garment. And it's mending, I think, is not as commonplace of a practice, because of contemporary kind of like flash fashion, and like the way we view garments as disposable, rather than caring for them. And that's something else that kind of like infuses this garment with life for me, is that it's not just something that someone wore. Like, it is perhaps in a sense its own being. So now let's get to the family photos. So it's kind of like after the process of like making the mock-up, I was so determined to go and find photos. And some of these are kind of blurry because I didn't want to take them out. These are out of very old photo albums. So starting on your right, with the red kind of jacket, that is my great-grandfather, Peter Myers. And that I assume is the coat, which I do know is actually more of a kind of modern, closer to like a modern idea of a Mackinaw jacket. And these two other photos are his younger brother, Johnny, who, clearly liked his coat enough to wear it in like two different pictures. And I think they're very smart coats. Johnny and another brother that wasn't pictured here served overseas during World War II. And that was something that kind of, when I was learned about that, I started thinking like, well, what are the chances that maybe they saw those coats, or they saw, this Mackinaw jacket, or like the Jeep coat, and when they got back, decided like, oh, they wanted one too, although they got one that was slightly stylistically different. But they were very, very proud of their coats, and apparently they'd wear them all the time. So that's kind of the overlaps between experiences. As well, my great-grandfather was a farmer. He hunted, he trapped, and so did Johnny as well, and so did most of the men of the family. It was kind of what you did to make ends meet. So there's that. And they also as well worked in the logging industry for a time when they were younger. My grandmother has memories of them staying up in one of the logging camps for a winter. And so there's some kind of additional overlap there with the original owner of the coat I worked on, even though they're from different backgrounds. And then I dug a little bit further and I found these photos from the other side of my family, unexpectedly. This is the Gladue family, and I only have the name of the gentleman on the left. Is Narcissus Gladue, and they are a Métis family that took in my great grandmother. She was adopted when she was a toddler. So that's her in the very center there, the kind of smiling yet blurred face. And it was so funny when I was looking through these photos with my mom, and she kind of pointed out, "Oh, isn't this a Mackinaw coat?" And I was like, "Oh my goodness, like you're right." And so there's two different examples here that are very similar to the one I worked on. You can see that kind of similar like shawl or like storm collar, and kind of like the double row of buttons, and then like the belt on one, and then kind of like the center button on the other one, which is kind of an interesting deviation or difference. And so I was beyond ecstatic to find this kind of like connection to the code and to the project, and something else I want to kind of like talk about, because when I look at these photos, I think of they were an older family when they took in my great grandmother, and they made her family. They and the kindness and like the care they showed her like in raising her, and the kind of this is a theme that seems to come up again and again with this coat. And in terms of like another detail about Alex Waddy is that was in the file is that he at one point during one winter he raised enough money trapping to send his daughter to school in Edmonton. And when I read that, I immediately thought of my grandparents and like, well, my great grandparents and the trapping they did, just to have a little bit extra something at Christmas for the kids, especially, and it's not just making do. It's not this coat isn't just like a working coat in the sense of going out and what the work these men did to provide for their families, but also to provide something better for them. It's really important. Yeah, so what is the difference? Well, there are three clearly very different projects in a sense. Well, very different like kind of object kind of like outcomes. But what kind of there's more to me similarities than there is differences, because what kind of holds them together is, in one sense, the materials, the community, and like the exchange of knowledge, and especially when it comes to like the intangible elements in these items. It's the social life that brings them together. That's the invisible stitch. Because I realized when I was making, when either I was making La Poutiane or I was like working on the mock-up or doing this write-up, that I reached out to my community to kind of be able to do that, because I didn't know, and really made me realize that the community is knowledge, and it's the stitch that holds things together. And that is really what kind of came out in the term, like in the duration of my internship and like working on these projects, is just how essential community is in this idea of the making community. It's a making community is not just a community of makers. They're like, it is actively like creating this environment of like shared knowledge and tradition and like caring for each other that is so essential to being Métis, for me at least. And I am so grateful to have had this opportunity, to once again learn more about my family and myself and what it means to be Métis. So I think that is the conclusion. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy this, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Skye. I'm always so blown away by how you make these amazing, beautiful connections back to your family and to your community. It's just been such a pleasure working with you this year and just like learning everything that you've discovered through your research. So thank you. So I guess, yeah, so it's time for Q&A. We went a little bit over time, but I think we have some time to do a few questions here. So if anybody has any questions, can you please put them down in the Q&A section? And just a short reminder, just to kind of keep your questions limited to the scope of Skye's presentation today and any of the research that she's done. So we'd love to hear from you. Okay, so we have one that says, what pulled the Red River carts?
So the favorite animal was usually oxen, but the carts could really be pulled by anything. I think oxen were the most common ones. There's apparently somewhere out there a photo of a Red River cart being pulled by a moose, but it's actually the structures of the carts is that they don't. They're built so there's just kind of a harness, so you could actually have a horse in there, or you could adapt it to almost anything that could pull it.
I don't think I'd like to try domesticating a moose, but we'll see. Another question is, I took the opportunity to check out your la poutine recipe. It calls for pastry spice. Can you explain what that is, as I've never heard of it?
Thank you for asking that, because I also was bewildered when I saw it. So I looked it up, and I guess the closest approximation would be like the Danish speculous, like kind of cookie powder, but you can substitute cinnamon, allspice, just typical, I guess, kind of warm pastry spices. You can make your own mix even. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Another question says, calling back to the ladies in the cart, is there anything specific about what they're wearing?
That's a really great question. I know that actually so traditional Métis garb was very kind of the times. We dressed for the times, but it was usually pretty everyday wear. We really liked our calico kind of prints, and with those ladies, I think they were just more dressing for the times, the fashion. So I don't think there's anything particular. I do think the shawl is very, very, very Métis.
Awesome. Those long skirts too, hey?
Yeah.
I have a question for you. So something that I found really interesting about all of the work that you do here with the La Poutine and I'm probably not pronouncing that right, and the Mackinaw jacket, and then your work last year with the birch bark baskets, is that you approach your research methodology by making things, by learning the process of making it from the scratch all the way to the end. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like what are the things that you learn by doing that kind of research methodology, which you might not learn if you were doing something that's a bit more academic based, I guess.
So I just recently learned that it is a type of methodology in terms of research creation. So making things, even though it has been like my kind of favorite approach, as you've noted, to projects. And going back, I guess there was something I've always thought that because I like to start with an item and then kind of not necessarily work backwards, but trying to recreate it is like, it just seems like, oh, I will understand this better if I make it. because by working with the same materials or an approximation of the same materials, and like undergoing like the same kind of trial and error and process, it's kind of an intimate process where you are learning from the making as much as, like as you are creating something. So it is my favorite approach. And I think there is like an important academic like research is it kind of important in providing like a context, or providing like a direction to go, so you can kind of establish yourself in with the right materials, or in kind of like the right context for making it.
Awesome. I can't wait to see what you make next. Maybe we'll get you to make a Red River card. Just kidding. Just one more question from Julia. She says, are you going to publish your research on the Mackinaw jacket? And if you need a journal, I can help.
Oh, I had not considered that, but as much as I have talked about the Mackinaw jacket, I actually would love to at some point, share that in a professional kind of capacity. So that would be awesome. Thank you. Maybe I will be in contact.
I think that would be an excellent idea, because working with you on this project, I mean, it really showed that there actually wasn't that much out there in terms of publications about the Mackinaw jacket, right? And even just like being able to find them in museum collections was quite tricky, I think. So I think that would be a great contribution.
Yeah.
One more question from Peggy. She says, I thought your comments about the sounds of the cart were wonderful. Any chance of that sound being recreated for visitors to RAM?
I think that is something that we were kind of hoping to work on at some point. The creator, Brianne, has expressed interest in being open to working with us on that. So I think that would be fantastic, but unsure at this point.
Yeah, fingers crossed. It's in the plans. So we hope to be able to do that when we install your new panel in the gallery. Awesome. Is there any more questions? We've gone a bit over time, but I think that's okay for a Friday afternoon.
I'd say so. Are we ready to wrap things up? Is that everything, I think? I just want to say a big thank you on behalf of all of us at FRAMS today for joining us here today. Thank you, Skye, for taking us on such a fascinating journey with you to discover the hidden stitch. That was just incredible. And thank you, Emma, for your great job moderating, and shout out to Drew from FRAMS, who's been working behind the scenes today to make sure that everything runs smoothly. Wow. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.